Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. Hello and welcome to another lecture in the contemporary world. Today's lecture is about nationalism and culture and global culture. Alright, understanding culture as part of our identity as individuals and as parts of communities or as members of communities is critical in understanding globalization as a phenomenon. Human beings, whether we like it or not, are lifelong learners, and more importantly, they are socialized into a community. Culture being shared values, no, according to Clifford Geertz. The idea of shared values strengthens our identity of not only who we are as individuals, but where do we belong and how do we understand the world. So culture serves multiple functions for us. It serves as a means for us to understand our place in the world, and it also serves as a means of, let's say, deposited knowledge and understanding that we need to use or that we can conveniently use from time to time in assessing our ever-changing world. As human beings, we are decision makers, and of course, not all decisions that we make are based on carefully crafted decisions. Many of the decisions we make are based on shared knowledge and values. Hence why there is culture, because human beings, whether we like it or not as well, cannot make decisions, using always using carefully crafted out thought. We need some guidelines. We need some we need some precedents so that we can arrive at conclusions and make decisions based on experiences that are not necessarily our own. So this is where culture is very important in the globalized world. Culture, as we know it, is not only ethnic, but culture is malleable. It can come from different sources. In fact, we are socialized throughout our lives using through associations with different groups, with different institutions in society, etc., etc. So this is also the case with global culture. Understanding that culture is not something fixed, but it is something malleable and fluid is critical for this discussion today. So one of the main values that we gain early on in life is nationalism. No? Nationalism is basically this concept that, for example, Filipinos are Filipinos based on certain traits, based on certain beliefs, based on certain values that they adhere to, and of course strengthened by common experiences that they went through as a people, no? Especially experiences that are, we can say, bitter or traumatic, and experiences that are also blissful, and experiences that give these people a kind of sense of belonging, that they are alike, right? So nationalism is an idea that hold nation states. The Philippines is a nation state, so holds nation states together. So the world is divided into nations, into competing identities of who we are as a people. Some nations can be very small, rooted only in a small geographic area. Other nations can be, let's say, they can be vast, and they occupy not only vast territories, but also their people are dispersed throughout the world. Like, for example, the Philippines has a massive diaspora community that is that plays a significant role in its identity in the world today. That shapes that identity continually with accumulated experiences as well. So national identity can be rooted in common culture, ethnicity, or it can be rooted in common experiences and of course the common understanding that people, let's say Filipinos, are Filipinos because of this, because of that. So we can argue that this is the concept of nationalism. Okay? So nationalism is clearly, it is clearly a social construct. No, our identity as people are not given, but they are constructed, recreated, reaffirmed almost on a daily basis. Right. So nationalism and culture, they go hand in hand basically. Nationalism is informed by culture. So you cannot have nationalism without culture. And culture as part of what makes us truly human is critical in our world today. Culture, as we know it, is again, it provides us with a sense of identity and belongingness. And yet culture also gives us this sense that there are other groups, that there are people whom we are against with. So this is how human beings have traditionally arranged themselves. No, that there is an in group, there's an out group as well. And as we can see, that culture, while it may be a force for uniting people behind a certain idea or behind a certain, let's say, proposal, etc., etc., and that eventually creates nationhood, for example, culture is not always right. Okay? Let's just put it at that. So we have a case study here. We have a highlight here wherein culture can be expressed in terms of religious beliefs and also cultural symbols. So there are norms as well. No, like say for example, the colorful the colorful materials that you see there is not only a vivid expression of individuals, but it is an expression of the community as well, and hence it is part of their culture. So cultural symbols are everywhere in our lives. And in fact, some of the cultural symbols are not only wearable, but they are also embedded into our literal skin. Tattoos, for example, have cultural symbolisms behind them. So culture and religion, well, if we can say that religion is also subsumed under culture, we can see that it is vital in the creation of the individual, in the creation of in the creation of, well, the economy partly, but also the creation of the community. And take note, culture as a unique as a unique thing, as a unique aspect of human beings, um, propels us to think beyond the individual and to think as a part of the community, whether that community be local or even global community. Okay, so we go back to nationalism as a foil here for our discussion. That nationalism is, again, it is created, right? It is something that is contracted by people. They maintain this so-called myth of nationalism. In fact, the late Benedict Anderson would say nationalism is the creation of imagined communities per se. The nationalism as a formation or as a formator of identity is also something that has caused many people um, problems, no? Especially when nationalism is taken to mean that when nationalism is taken as a means for not only discriminating but even killing other people, when nationalism is weaponized. And we can see that clearly in the ethnic cleansing of Rohingyan Muslims in Myanmar, wherein the Buddhist majority have labeled them as outsiders, as not non-citizens, and hence why their rights were taken away, their homes were burned, and many of them driven to exodus in nearby Bangladesh. So that's it. So nationalism, again, I think we've discussed this. Nationalism has precipitated many of the problems of the modern world today. although it did give us, or it does continue to give us, a sense of belongingness, no? But perhaps we can ask ourselves, is nationalism outdated? And what should replace nationalism? Should it be considered as outdated? What kind of identity can surpass or can subsume, or no, not subsume, but can surmount the idea that you belong to a nation? Okay. So there are models of ethnic relations as well that are critical for our understanding of the world today. Say, for example, a country can have multiple ethnicities, and yet within this country, there are ethnicities that are not only favored, but they form the majority of the people. Case in point, for example, in China, overwhelmingly, people in China identify themselves as from the Han ethnic group, which is the largest ethnic group in the world, perhaps today. No, so more than around 89 or more than 80% of the population in China um, identify as from the Han ethnic group. Okay, so there's also there's the mode of assimilation, for example, wherein this Han ethnic group has also historically let's say, absorbed or incorporated different cultures throughout its long history as a nation. Then there is also the creation of, or rather, there is also this notion of aggregation, wherein communities join together from different cultures and come up with something. No, we can call it as fusion cultures. The Philippines is a fusion culture of unique proportions, wherein here comes a Latinized Christian, let's say, Christian community in Tagalog regions, and in Luzon and Visayas, there are Latinized Christian communities merging together with other communities throughout the islands, no? And this created this notion of, let's say, the Philippines, or Filipinos as we know it, and it creates a single culture eventually, no? So that's it. Then there's multiculturalism, or the inclusion of diverse cultures, but not necessarily the aggregation or assimilation of them. And this is a model best illustrated by the United States right now in what is called as the melting pot of the world, wherein so many people come to the U.S. to immigrate and to work there, that basically there is a multicultural scene of people having different backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and to some degree different races, no, different colors of their skin, to put it mildly. And it's not always an easy, let's say, an easy arrangement. There has been a history of discrimination and downright racism in the United States, but I think it's working to some degree nonetheless. No, so there are difficulties as well, but with all things worthy, or with all things, as with all things worthwhile, difficulties are to be expected, and the rewards for overcoming such difficulties are more often than not um, worth it, to put it that way. Okay, so there's also forms of nationalism aside from the modes of ethnic relations. Nationalism can be in the form of elite nationalism, ethnic nationalism, mass nationalism, or civic nationalism, etc., etc. We can see expressions of nationalism, especially in government offices or in schools in particular, whenever the day starts for us. So there's the raising of the flag, for example, and the taking down of the flag every day, at designated times, especially during the early morning and in the late afternoon. So that's an expression of nationalism as well. Okay. So here's another example of nationalism on display, wherein some people are elevated to the status of heroes or their stories are celebrated to reinforce the narrative that the Philippines is a country. No? So, for example, the story of the SAF 44. Okay. Then nationalism can also be strengthened. It can also be weakened. No, or rather, the state can be weakened and strengthened by nationalism. Okay. The idea here is that there are countries, unfortunately, there are countries that are right from the start, right from when they were created or aggregated together as colonies and later on as independent countries, there are countries that have problems establishing national identity. Case in point, Syria and Lebanon, for example, which currently has many ethnic groups vying for power there. So many of those countries in the Middle East that were originally mandates dating back to the First World War, no mandates by the League of Nations to be governed by powerful imperial states like France and Britain. These states, once they became independent, they were not really endowed, or they were not really given, let's say, a robust tutelage in national identity. So they had to muddle through and to create their own experiences, to appeal to the reason of people that they are one people, because most likely in these countries, tribal association is stronger than the political affiliations of individuals and communities towards the country. Also, another case of that would be Afghanistan, for example. We might wonder why Afghanistan fell so quickly to the Taliban. Partly because many of its people did not view themselves as, let's say, as Afghans per se. They viewed themselves as coming from different ethnic groups, and this is the reality in Afghanistan, as with many other neighboring states there. Right. By there I mean neighboring states with Afghanistan in Central Asia, which is the region of Afghanistan. All right. Talking about global politics and nationalism, nationalism is recently, well, we can say it is a recent phenomenon, no? And nationalism, as we know it, became critical in our understanding of the world today. Right now, we view the world from a nationalistic lens. We may enjoy the different products, cultural products of different countries. Say, for example, we may enjoy the entertainment brought about by the Hangul wave of Korea. And but yet, when we view ourselves, when we look at ourselves, we always look at ourselves more likely than not from the perspective of who we are as a people. There is that there is that, well, not popular, but there is that notion that nationalism defines us. Okay, so there's that factor as well, no? And we can say that nationalism as a concept really took off in the 1900s. Sorry, not just in the 1900s, but even before that, it started to take off during the late 1800s, when colonized people like Filipinos, for example, began to challenge Western domination of their homeland. Famous example of this would be the very salient essay of Dr. Jose Rizal in his um, in his writing called, or in his essay called, The Indolence of the Filipinos, wherein he argued against the common myth that Filipinos and in general colonized peoples are lazy. And here Rizal was already writing to prove that colonized people can think for themselves and they deserve the right to self-determination, that people can can basically determine who they are, not through the grace of, let's say, of civilizing missions that are largely not only cynical but largely, let's say, that are largely patronizing to people who have been conquered by superior European arms and dominated by superior European economics at that time, no? So we can say that the idea of national self-determination for many people around the world, especially by people of colonized backgrounds like Rizal and Dr. Sun Yat-sen of China, we can see that national self-determination is a natural response, or is a natural concept brought about by the longing to overthrow the yoke and to overthrow the condescension of Europeans looking down at colored and colonized peoples around the world at that time. So this became a sort of, let's say, global culture as well, that people from different backgrounds, they find themselves not only in solidarity with one another, as with the case with Sun Yat-sen and Rizal, but they found themselves to be, let's say, having similar experiences. In fact, experiences so similar that nearly 70 years later, after Rizal published his excellent essay, The Indulgence of Filipinos, a Malaysian, no, Dr. Syed Hussein Alatas, actually responded to Rizal and created, let's say, an excellent book using the framework that Rizal outlined in his essay, no, and Syed Alatas wrote a book called the Myth of the Lazy Native, and I had the privilege of actually talking to his son and asking his son about the book. So Professor Alatas is long dead now, but his work, his legacy live on, and in fact, he was continuing a cultural discussion that transcends nationality, that transcended ethnic divides as well, because colonization doesn't really care about colonization doesn't really care about ethnic divides. um, it's a common phenomenon. It's a common enough phenomenon that it gave rise to a global culture of decolonization and struggle against oppression. So that's how national determination, or national self-determination continues to, let's say, to be relevant for us as people of color and as people who have been colonized as well. Okay. There's also the imperial project of the British, and later on followed by the Americans, no, in their so-called Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, or British peace and then American peace. So because of their common grounds, common origins as Anglo-Saxon countries, not common culture. Take note, the United States was once a colony of Great Britain for centuries. So yeah, in this sense that even 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 hegemonic countries, even imperial countries, make use of culture to justify their domination of the world. Their continued, let's say, their continued meddling in international affairs, nonetheless, no. So nationalism became central in the new nation states. As we all know, nation states after the Second World War, they began to pop up like mushrooms because former colonies that were now too expensive and too difficult to maintain by the European colonial masters, they have become, or they have freed themselves, and some were granted freedom by their colonial masters. So in a sense, there were new states that were created, and hence, for example, in the field of political science, there was the creation of new academic subdisciplines like comparative politics to try to understand how these new nation states emerge in the first place, and where can they go after they have been granted, or they have won independence from them for themselves. Okay, so state building, or rather let's say the undermining of state building via ethnic nationalism, had limited success, but it doesn't mean it has gone away. Some of them are still present today, and most notably, ethnic nationalism is alive and well in many parts of the developed world of Europe. In particular, in Spain, there is the Catalan independence movement that has gained international attention, and it has gained considerable influence in Spain nowadays. No, they wanted to secede from Spain, and they were only prevented from doing so by the Spanish authorities preventing the Catalan organizers, the Catalan social movements, from conducting a referendum. So in a way, nationalism is alive and well today, and in fact, it has seen a huge comeback in recent years. And there's also counter nationalism rejected imperial power. I think I've discussed this very extensively when I was talking about national self determination earlier. Okay. All right. So there's also Rizal and globalization. Why Rizal became, let's say, a poster child for, or rather, a poster boy for Filipino nationalism, in the way that Filipinos are encouraged not only to emulate the example of Rizal, but to try to understand where his ideas are not only coming from, but where his ideas should lead the country. It is very important for the Philippines to not only dwell in the past as a nation state, but also to chart its own course going forward. And this is the gift of national self-determination, of independence. Basically, we are not simply in limbo. We are not simply sitting down and doing nothing. We are constantly building our country, and we need to have a national vision of where we are going if ever we are to progress. All right. So globalization has to put it mildly, has been a huge challenge for countries, for states, basically. Why? Because states are territorial in nature. They are territorial entities, and globalization has brought about many technologies, and not only many technologies, but many phenomenon that are transboundary in nature. For example, climate change cannot be arrested by border police. No, they cannot be. Countries cannot deploy their militaries at their border and say to storms, for example, "Oops, you cannot enter." They cannot do that. So there's also that challenge that states' territorial power, especially in its traditional expressions of power, usually military or diplomatic means, are ineffective in combating the global problems of the 21st century. So there's also another paradox to this. National identity still matters, no? It is still essential for nation states. Despite the fact that nation states are being challenged by global problems, people still cling to their national identity. Why is that? And perhaps more importantly, is national identity seriously being challenged by climate change? No, or not only climate change, but trans transboundary problems that go beyond any political divide or even ethnic and cultural divide for that matter. No? Why are people still holding on to their identities? Or perhaps we can ask, will we see the emergence of new identities in order to, let's say, the emergence of new identities as responses to the challenges of the 21st century that are transboundary or transborder in nature? Okay, so I think we will have to end our lecture there, and it was quite exciting as a lecture, and I think I shared a lot of my opinions, a lot of my understandings on this subject matter at hand. Culture for me remains to be fascinating, and it really works my mind on this subject. No, culture is something that I crave for. It is something that might be nebulous, but it's something that can that can really fire up the imagination per se. And so with that, we'll end this presentation, or I'll end this discussion. Thank you for coming, and I'll catch you on the next one.